for this panel, we want to have a perspective that's human-centered, right? When we think about Bitcoin and financial inclusion. And hopefully through our discussion, we can illustrate how confidence in legacy financial institutions have eroded over time and why Bitcoin, with its unique monetary properties, is the only existing network that can fully really reinstate that trust. So, to get a grounding, when we look at statistics, 44% of the people who own Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are people of color, right? 30% of Black investors own cryptocurrency versus only 17% of white investors. So, in our nation today, on a percentage basis, people of color are leading cryptocurrency adoption by over double digits, right? So I think that's a framework that we should keep in mind as these conversations continue. And and I think in this conversation, the idea of trust, trusting in finance, trusting in banking services, and the historical precedent that has been set for marginalized communities, underserved communities, and how has that trust been broken at many times? And what about Bitcoin can reinstate that? So I guess I'll start with, well, you're next to me, Adrian, so I'll go with you.
Let's do it.
So give us a sense of, what are some current barriers of gaining fair access to finance in America today?
Yeah. So what you didn't hear in my title was I'm actually the Economic and Community Development Director for Foundry, and I'm also Director for Foundry Deploy and Repair. And we service the greater Rochester Finger Lakes community in upstate New York. And so we have great challenges as it relates to poverty. For those of you who don't know, Rochester is third in the country in poverty overall, and we're second in childhood poverty. And so as it relates to really bringing folks into the Bitcoin network and seeing the potential that lies there as it relates to access to financial services without being, turned away because of your credit report, your credit history, or how much income you make, or just bias in general that the current legacy systems have built into them. Education has been the greatest barrier because not only is there the FUD of the media narratives around the Ponzi schemes and you could lose your money, and you're talking about folks who already don't have access to large sums of money. So what they do have, they have to take and what they're going to do with it very seriously. And so what we've done in Rochester is created educational effort at every stage of the P12 pipeline. And I won't go too in depth with that, but at the high school level, we've designed a blockchain fundamentals course. And for any of you who have struggled your way through a Bitcoin 101, you know why high school kids need their own blockchain fundamentals to really help them understand those properties that you talked about. But even before that, at the K-12 or the elementary level, we started a program called DeFi, which stands for Decentralizing Education for Youth. And we realized that before you can even deal with blockchain fundamentals at the high school level, you have to have a strong STEM foundation at the elementary level. And that's the cornerstone of that is math. And so we bring math enrichment in to fourth grade students and eighth grade students within our city schools 2 to 3 times a week. So these are just efforts that we've taken to overcome the educational barrier, not just to get beyond the FUD, but to ensure that folks who have a great need for the promise of decentralized infrastructure, that they know how to go about using it and that they have the capabilities to do so.
Great. And moving along, I would say taking from the education is definitely a barrier. Um, I don't think anybody in here is in high school. So for those, what are some other barriers that we are constantly facing?
Yeah, so Ian, you mentioned this idea of mistrust or lack of trust between marginalized communities and the traditional finance system. I think it's really important to be honest about the past. But here's the thing, you don't even have to look to the past to see the problem. You can actually look in the present. In 2021, Wells Fargo paid $186 million of a fine for steering subprime loans to Black and Latino investors. Just last year, Wells Fargo paid a $3.7 billion fine for a range of consumer protection violations. But this thing is not limited to Wells Fargo. JP Morgan Chase paid a $20 million fine for racial discrimination with regard to their financial advisor business. And the list goes on and on and on. So when you tell me that the United States banking system or traditional finance is working, my question is, working for whom? That's the bad news. But here's the good news. Bitcoin is a new, open, transparent monetary system that is our opportunity to finally get it right. This is our chance to be honest about the mistakes, mostly policy mistakes of the past, recognize who's been marginalized, recognize who's been unbanked, underbanked, badly banked, and credit invisible, bring those people in the fold and give them the financial access that they deserve to finally participate in the American economy.
Yeah, and if you look at, the current American financial system, they've had about 100 years to close the gap in underserved communities, communities of color, and you just really have not seen any sizable shift in banking the unbankable. Or let's get into, redlining for property, or the fact that people of color with the same background, other than being the wrong zip code and being a person of color, get charged higher rates or don't even get access to a small business loan. So the system is just, I don't say it's not working, but it's not working for millions and millions of Americans. And so you were kind and said an erosion of trust. I would say in some communities, there's just never been that trust established. And a lot
It's
of this
broken.
is like showing up. And if you don't have access to a brick and mortar bank, who do you have trust with? And so, I think there was a report, this is fintech writ large, but during the pandemic, the San Francisco Fed even said when, fintech, which crypto is part of that broad kind of category, when that was employed, you started to see for the first time loans being spread out more representative of the community as large. So we've had 100 years. It'd be great if some of the big banks you mentioned made major strides or even big strides. But as you kind of pointed out, in the last couple of years, got a couple $1 billion of fine for not making progress, but in some ways institutionalizing the ability to make any means moving forward. So
Absolutely. And to give a historical context, I won't give a full history lesson, but when we going from today to the beginning of the banking system for emancipated Black, former slaves, right? When we look at yes, exactly, the Freedmen's Bank, Savings Bank, it was instated in 1865. And this was the savings bank. It was through U.S. Charter, U.S. Charter Bank. And within 10 years, former slaves, they put in $72 million into this bank, right? This is, 1870s, right? Which would be worth $5 billion today. $5 billion today. And through mismanagement, through exploitation, and blatant plundering, that was all evaporated. So when we talk about trust, what trust? There hasn't been trust from the beginning of banking in underserved communities, and it only continues to this day. Now, that may be the DNA, but it comes down to now it may look like, oh, you're considered higher financial risk, right? And so on average, uh, with the same level of credit worthiness, background in education, salary, Black customers have to pay on average 1.4% higher interest rates. Right? And this is just the reality. I don't have, I don't know the opaque calculations behind the closed doors, what's calculated, but I sure know the results, right? So I think that well established, the current sort of conditions. Now,
but I do want to point out, though, what that leaves is then the predatory lending. And so now if you actually need access to money quickly, you're paying rates 10, 20, no, that's generous, 50, 60, 70, 100%, 200%. And there's statistics I think you've all seen that the average, it's like 60% of America couldn't come up with $400 in an emergency if they had to, which is just,
Savings.
that is a very scary thought to begin with. But then you think about, well, how can they get that? Even if they have a friend or family that they can do it, the transaction fees to get from one place to another, you really put a lot of Americans in a jam by having just not only just the lack of financial services, but those that you do have access to are so punitive in purpose.
Right. So having that grounding, let's look at alternatives, right? If the current system hasn't worked for many groups here in America, I know Alex Gladstein had the human rights perspective that takes a global look, but looking domestically here, for those who are in need. Um, when we look at the crypto market, there's tens of, 10,000, 15,000 different coins. Look at DeFi. All right, if we know this current system is not working, um, what about a DeFi protocol in terms of, does it bring the same level of financial autonomy that is often desired in these communities?
Well, I can speak to a project that we're launching in Rochester, but it's really in its infancy right now because we're still thinking through what execution would look like. But we're partnering with local community-based organizations and trying to figure out how can we get some of these impoverished families to get ownership of their data and information. And a lot of you know that data right now is the new oil. A lot of these huge tech companies are making most of their money off of the collection of data and then the selling of that data. So how can we give families that are in poverty ownership of their data, put it on the blockchain, and then allow them to decide who gets access to it? And when they give access to it, how do we also ensure that they get a return, whether it's some kind of token or other kind of cryptocurrency, to where it's also transferable in USD? And we're trying to figure out now with our tech company called Tech Rochester, which is a conglomeration of different tech companies within our community-based organizations who work directly with the organizations, and us at Foundry convening this whole effort to really figure out how do we wield this technology and execute on the socioeconomic problem-solving power that is inherent within it. And then I'll just close with this. The real, in our minds, we understand Bitcoin is really just the door, right? Blockchain has a lot of potential. And we feel like the only way to really realize that potential is to ensure that the people who are closest to need and in need understand what it can do and then determine what those uses are. And I think right now that the conversation of use cases is a really technical conversation where people are trying to figure out the applicability of blockchain technology without really understanding the needs of the folks who can be best served by it. And so that's our theory of action at Foundry, is to figure out how to develop these kinds of use cases that have an applicability to where folks are most in need.
So
I'll just say real quick, Adrian, you're nicer than me because you're not going to call out other protocols. But go ahead.
So for me, it's just really simple. Bitcoin is a better choice of money for the world. Bitcoin protects the everyday or the purchasing power of the everyday American. It protects the purchasing power of Africans. It attacks the purchasing power of everyday people in the global South, right? It allows people access to open, honest, transparent money, giving them the ability to have the autonomy and self-sovereignty to have a brighter financial future. And that is something that everyone on this planet deserves.
And to me, to sum it up, Bitcoin is colorblind. And when so many people are excluded from financial services, again, because of the color of their skin or the zip code they live in, Bitcoin and Bitcoin protocol doesn't operate under that kind of system, thankfully.
And so to your point, right? Because I think it's an important one. So when you talk about the purchasing power of folks, and what we've noticed, and I think a lot of you have, I think one of the biggest, barriers to people using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, which is the fact that some folks who don't have a lot of money, if you put like $10 into Bitcoin, it could be $8, right? Like it could be $12. Like it fluctuates. And then even getting local merchants to want to accept Bitcoin, right, in lieu of USD and other currencies, has also been a little bit of a challenge. So we actually just launched a nonprofit at Foundry called Rock the Block. And two of the primary missions of Rock the Block is, number one, to promote the widespread adoption of these technologies, because we have to assemble a network of different businesses within our ecosystem locally, so that if a person did want to use Bitcoin as their preferred means of exchange, they could walk into a grocery store or anywhere else they have needs and it could be accepted. But also promoting the widespread adoption of the use of Bitcoin, because not only do we want it to appreciate in value, but we also want to provide price stability, right? It's difficult for folks to use it or to trust it if they just put in $15 and they're like, oh, my $15 that I was going to use to do this just turned into $12, right? So we do want to promote widespread adoptions so that we can bring some stability, and so folks can, build that trust within the system and the network as well.
So let's look into use cases and how we each use it in our business, avocation. I think that's very important. I'll start with you, Charlene. Um, you got your way into many different doors. You speak into the top of the top. So as a Bitcoin consultant for corporations and networks overall, how is Bitcoin involved in your work?
Yeah, so as was mentioned before, I run a company called Mango Digital Strategies, and we partner with corporations and deliver Bitcoin education in Black and Brown communities. And so last year, I had the pleasure of going to a number of U.S. cities and really talking about Bitcoin and sharing. And I'll just tell a quick story, which I think really embodies the experiences that I had, nearly during every session. So after I finished my session, a woman, her name was Marta, came up to me and said, "Hey, Charlene, I've been a Bitcoiner for 3 years." Now, Marta was Afro-Latina, probably in her early 50s. And she said, "Not only am I a Bitcoin investor, I've never been a stock investor. And I taught all of my friends how to use Bitcoin." And I said, "That's amazing, Marta." And then she made my jaw drop. And she said, "Charlene, at the all-time high, I sold a portion of my portfolio and took my mother on her very first vacation to Portugal." And so, to me, that story is so important because it dispels this myth that low-income people can't learn Bitcoin. It dispels this myth that, it's too complicated for people to understand. It dispels this myth that they're not okay. They need to be protected from an investment industry. And time again, where I went to Newark, New Jersey, Durham, North Carolina, I went to Boston, and it was the same story. There were folks that had never invested in the traditional markets before, felt very comfortable and fluent in Bitcoin, and they were proud to show me that they were Bitcoin investors. And then the one last thing is that there's something that really changes a person when they feel like they're a Bitcoin investor. And I've shared this story before, but they sit up a little bit straighter. They smile, they're confident, right? So you're seeing just this idea of financial empowerment, this financial autonomy, this financial independence that everybody, both in marginalized communities and not, everyone wants, needs, and deserves. And that is the power of Bitcoin. And that is the power of Bitcoin in marginalized communities in the United States and all around the world.
Right. And I think what's really important about when we talk about the unique properties, permissionless access, permissionless access. In no time in history where, certain populations had to ask permission, they got the short end of the stick every single time, right? That's why this network is so incredibly important and powerful. Greg, I'm going to have to ask you, not a gotcha, but I'm going to read it so I don't mess up here. So, as a former Biden administration campaign manager, fair access to a monetary network that mitigates, if not fully eliminates subjective discrimination in financial accessibility would seem to be a cause that would be, let's say, enthusiastically championed, right? However, the current environment does not reflect this. Could you speak to where that disconnect stands?
Yeah, and I'll separate. There's the Hill and all of the variances that happen on the Hill, and then I'm just going to talk about the well-meaning, generic Biden policy staffer who understands that one of the 4 pillars of the Biden administration in the first term is racial equity. So that's the perspective I'm trying to like reach into their mind. And you imagine, you talk about all the policies to close the racial wealth gap. You talk about all the policies, whether it's how long people live or the earning potential. And you look at like this policymaker's mind, and it's climate and how does that affect your rates of asthma. You look at access to capital to start a small business. You look at workforce training, educational opportunities. You look at crime. These are all, so in your mind, it's like, okay, I've got to help move the ball forward on racial equity. And you've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 buckets that we've been debating, working on for decades. And so then you've got like this much left of bandwidth for like new ideas. This isn't like a critique. This is just the reality of a White House job or a job at HUD or Commerce. I mean, you got this much. And what you notice, what you know about crypto or Bitcoin is basically a bunch of white guys that live in Silicon Valley or New York tweet, either it's about Elon Musk and Doge or Sam Bankman-Fried, and all of this like bandwidth in your mind for like what this digital asset is, what Bitcoin is taken up by basically, I don't want to just single out those 2 guys, but that's like a symbol of like, that's the bandwidth. And so at that point, the conversation ability for digital asset and Bitcoin conversations is basically taken up. I think the reality is when you look at the international, where you have super high inflation or you've got authoritarian regimes, and you have to rely on Bitcoin because there really isn't a real financial services system, that is a easier to understand use case from like a policymaker's mind. When you're in the United States and you're like, well, 90% of people use the traditional financial services. We've got all these other things to work on. We are not at a spot yet that Bitcoin and digital assets, we're able to have a real honest conversation. Now, I'm actually hopeful. I think Rahm Emanuel had this great quote, like, don't waste a good crisis. And in some ways, crypto winter, if that's what it's okay to call that, I think gives us a reset because the hype is gone. And I think the hype was taking up a lot of bandwidth because all you knew is the prices kept going up and white people in particular just kept getting rich. And I think now we actually can go back to like use cases, and that's not like the industry's fault. It's a reality of just the market for the last couple of years. And it's not helped again by Sam Bankman-Fried and Elon Musk. But my hope is that the use cases, the story you just mentioned, we can begin telling those stories. We can begin telling those stories. And I think we have to find, and I'm glad you said stability. Trust is super important, but stability is very important too. The last thing you want to do in a community that is faced lots of disruptions is throw in more instability. But I do think these small use cases and the narrative around Bitcoin, I'm not saying it needs to change, but it needs to be more focused to the right audiences. And some of you may have seen the announcement with Tim Ryan and David McIntosh. I think that's my hope, is that under that effort, under this Bitcoin Policy Institute umbrella, can actually make some strides towards that. But it gets down to bandwidth. I actually have talked to friends in the Biden administration, and like literally I had coffee with someone in the White House who's a friend, and she's like, "Oh, Greg, you still doing like stuff on crypto?" Because she has an account at, and she's got some different coins. So they're there. We just have to make we have to simplify it and give them a real world example that we can grow out.
Charlene, I want to ask you a similar question. Looking at the disconnect, we look at Bitcoin, it should be nonpartisan, right? It should be nonpartisan, and, and how it's designed is in a way that serves the least of these, right? And right now, the predominant sort of narrative and the loudest voices uh, um, are mostly coming from one side of the aisle. And this could be a utility that would help the constituencies that many parties, are defending and fight for legislation to protect. So, is it a messaging issue? Is where are the solutions there? You see?
Well, I think that a conversation, an event like this is the first step, right? I think that we have to begin to start sharing those more nuanced narratives of Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin has grown up quite a bit over the past couple of years, and we have to get a little bit smarter and a little more sophisticated about how we tell the story. Bitcoin is different things to different people. We all know that, right? And people receive the message of Bitcoin in a different way, and it absolutely depends on who's delivering that message. Right? That's the same thing. Remember, Bitcoin is money. Money is personal. It's emotional. It's cultural. We need to remember that. And when we're delivering these conversations about Bitcoin, understand our audience and make sure we're creating a narrative that's going to resonate. I think that we are on the path to success with telling a more sophisticated, more advanced Bitcoin narrative that is very complex. But it is steeped in the utility, both in the United States, but also around the world.
So I just want to, I'll piggyback on the two answers from my colleagues here and just say this. When we think about the best way to go about promoting technology, I think as an industry, number one, we have to be more strategic with who our allies are, who our champions are, and who become the faces of our cause. Having recently just been elected by a joint session of the New York State Legislature and now being on the New York State Board of Regents, where we oversee all educational activities within the state of New York, I can make sure it's a priority that technical education and ensuring that kids have the skills that they're going to need to be successful in the future. Mind you, a future that for many of us is already here, but for them, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the world is going to look very, very different. And so I think in many ways, we have to be honest as an industry when it comes to electing our own leaders and electing our own champions and people who are products of our industry, who know the ins and outs and the benefits and can provide us advocacy stability, regardless of what the gravity in places like Washington or Albany says. So that's number one. Number two, we have to have a more holistic approach because, to your point, Charlene, movements come from the bottom up, right? So we have to go and engage the folks in the population that this technology has the most promise for. And so I just want to give a small example of something that we did at Foundry to try to do that. We're talking about the front end investments, the price of Bitcoin and whatnot. But if you heard earlier from other panels, there's a whole industry of controllable loads and the intersectionality between Bitcoin mining and energy and even the mining operations themselves. And you know what we brought to inner city Rochester? Jobs, not just any jobs, high paying jobs. And we brought them to youth because we understood that they were going to be a part of this decentralized infrastructure in the future. We took our first cohort. They needed math and literacy enrichment. We gave them that. They needed driver's education for licenses. We gave them that. They needed cars. We gave them transportation grants for that. And then we gave them $60,000 a year jobs, which put them at 100% of an African-American within New York State and 200% of an African-American within Greater Rochester. And guess what? They can go and evangelize this message to their families and their neighborhoods because their lives are transformed. And these young people, to build on your point, Charlene, right? These young people who many folks would have casted away, not only started with installation and deinstallation, but now they've gone on to do troubleshooting, diagnostics, and repair. And Foundry has a whole business service now powered by this cohort of young adults who have embraced the technical side of Bitcoin mining. And so my point is, there's a message to be told in holistic perspective, and it has to come from the ground up. Last piece, you talked about historical context. I've heard in many different communities, folks wanting to bring back something called Black Wall Street, which existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma. All the means to do so exist now with this technology. And so are we thinking outside the box enough to put all the pieces together to start to create those kinds of vibrant inner city economic corridors to transform communities? And guess what, Greg? That's your use case. That's the narrative. That's what people have to see to tell elected leaders You don't have a choice on whether you're going to support this or not. But we have to be smart and strategic about how we operate as an industry and be clear about what our objectives are. We can't, I always say hope is not a strategy. We can't just hope at some point people's perspectives to what we do are going to change. We have to be just as intentional as our opposition.
Amazing. I think we have a couple of minutes, so I just want to sort of leave you guys with this scenario. Because when people ask me, like, okay, why Bitcoin? And I say it's a permissionless network, right? It's the purest form of financial autonomy. So what does that mean? Everybody think about your worst enemy. Think about the person who doesn't want you to succeed, doesn't want your kids to do well, economically advance. And if they were in control of your banking, they'll try to make it as difficult as possible for you to advance, right? Worst person. Okay. So when we look at the traditional financial system, if that person was at the levers, they could restrict you from certain access, right? They could do that. It's central authority. Okay. Then we didn't talk about CBDCs, but that, puts that level of control on steroids, right? So they really could dictate, where you're spending your money. All right. We look at DeFi, we look at proof of stake. We didn't talk too much about that, but it runs by a consensus mechanism that, the golden rule. Whoever holds the gold makes the rules. So it compounds wealth over time, if you're a node validator. But Bitcoin, your worst enemy, if he or she participates in that network, the only thing that it can do is further secure your coins on the blockchain. That's all he can do by participating. Him working in his self-interest is helping secure your coins on the blockchain. So respectfully, there is no better alternative. And with that, thank you.